All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Let me thank everyone for being here this morning. Let me thank Brendan Hanlon, our Chief Financial Officer, for being up here with me. But I also want to send a special shout out to Stephanie Adams, our Budget Director, and her entire team, and all the folks, of course, at the Chief Financial Officer's office as well. Thank you for your leadership. To the members of the Cabinet who are here, thank you as well for your presence and your leadership in the development of this year's, our 2021's budget. So we start off by going, whew, what a difference a year makes. Just a year ago, amid the biggest economic expansion in history, I released the 2020 budget that recognized signs of a coming recession. I remember very clearly Brendan and I talking about the potential challenge of the economy slowing down. As it turns out, that was very good foresight. Economists say the U.S. entered a recession in February of this year, but that was hugely overshadowed in late March when the pandemic almost completely brought the global economy to a standstill. In just 2 months, the United States lost 22.2 million jobs, dwarfing even the Great Depression. For perspective, the U.S. lost 8.7 million jobs during the 2 years of the Great Recession, 8.7 million jobs during the entire 2 years of the Great Recession. The U.S. lost 2.5 times that amount in just 2 months in 2020. In Denver, more than half of our budget comes from sales and tourism taxes, two industries that took the brunt of the impact from COVID-19. We are forecasting a revenue decrease of $220 million this year, the worst loss of city revenue since 1933. We are closing the 2020 budget gap by reducing agency budgets, freezing most hiring, requiring employees to take furloughs, and using a portion of our reserves. I wish 2021 looked better. The reality is 2021 is just as uncertain as the last 6 months have been because of the pandemic is ongoing. This 2021 budget marks a year of significant and difficult cuts necessary to close a gap of approximately $190 million between our projected revenues and expenditures. This budget carefully manages the uncertainty of the public health and economic crises with our obligation to serve the community and rebuild our local economy in a way that is sustainable and equitable. The 2021 proposed budget identifies savings in most city agencies and reflects the priorities of, one, supporting those who need it the most, where we will continue our efforts to support our most vulnerable by increasing our investments in shelter, housing, healthcare, and social services. Two, by continuing to respond to the coronavirus pandemic and protect public health with the resources needed to prepare the city to handle a potential surge of cases in the winter, the potential distribution of a vaccine to the community, and prioritize support for people most in need. And finally, getting people back to work, to rebuilding our local economy with the tools that we know will work to support the stability and long-term recovery by providing equitable opportunities to residents and businesses. Along with the pandemic and economic challenges, we continue to face the challenge of keeping our children, families, and neighborhoods safe. I've said it before, but I think it's worth saying again. No one, especially children, should feel unsafe in their neighborhood. The rise in crime, particularly youth violence, is greatly concerning to me and everybody in this room, which is why my budget does, while also continuing to reform the criminal justice system, make strategic investments in combating the rise of youth violence. Now, let's just address what I know is on everyone's mind. This budget does not support a false choice between safety and transforming our criminal justice system. It does both. We increase support for the STARS program, which we hope to grow to each police district. We continue to support our co-responders and our first responders. We stand up the first full year of funding for the Solutions Center. And finally, we continue scores of other reforms, efforts undertaken over the last 15 years. And we're not doing this in a silo. We will continue our community engagement around these reformations to ensure our community weighs in and we create a more sustainable and just system for everyone. As a reminder, we will continue. I want to make it very clear that everyone understands this as a reminder. I apologize. This city workforce makes up 70% of our general fund expenditures. So it's difficult to close the budget gap without impacting our employees. Today, this budget avoids layoffs of our city workforce. Instead, we greatly reduce hiring and hold more than 400 of our career service positions vacant, which will impact the timeliness of some of our city services. The budget calls for furlough days in 2021, as we've had in 2020, but it'll be a little different next year. We have developed a tiered system where those who earn the most take the most days, while those who earn the least are required to take fewer furlough days. I will be requiring city mayoral appointees, to take 9 furlough days next year. So I'm going to frame this for you. I strongly believe, as we did during the Great Recession, that by working together, by following the advice of medical professionals and scientists, by supporting our local businesses, restaurants, and retailers, and by addressing years of systemic racism and inequality, building a more resilient and sustainable systems. I believe in my heart that Denver will come back stronger as we did following the 2008 Great Recession. Denver is one of the few cities that have been forecasted to come back better from this great economic impact. And of course, making sure that we all across this nation continue to address the impacts of coronavirus. If we stay focused, if we use the tools we know have already proven to help revitalize the economy, I believe we'll begin to turn the corner once a vaccine and herd immunity begins to take place in our economy. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our Chief Financial Officer, Brendan Hanlon, who will address in great detail the budget for 2021.
Thank you very much, Mayor Hancock. And as you noted, it has been an incredibly difficult budget year, not just for the finance team, but the administration, our city employees, our agencies, our elected officials across the board. And I just want to thank you for your leadership during this crisis. I want to make sure I also spend some time thanking members of my team, specifically the Budget Management Director, Stephanie Adams, and the entire Budget and Management team and all the work that they've put in, countless hours. Laura Perry and the Capital Planning and Programming team, making sure that we have a solid capital program with solid capital investments that help us support a robust recovery. And Margaret Danuser, my Deputy CFO, who's been leading our financial emergency response and working on how do we manage our federal funds. And of course, all of my colleagues, many of which are here, who their teams have spent countless hours deliberating internally, not just for 2020, but also 2021, and the budget choices that they needed to make as a team, being sensitive to the services that they have to support every single day and their employees that help staff them. They have gone through painstaking efforts to get to where we're at today. I just want to thank them for all of their time. As the mayor said, this is not an easy budget year. In fact, it is the most difficult budget year I've experienced in my nearly 19-year career here at the city. Never have we had to overcome a $220 million gap in our current year funding and then simultaneously work on closing a $190 million gap for the next budget year. I want to first start by talking about where we are economically in 2020 and then give some more detail on the 2021 budget. A few of you might remember this graph that's behind me. It shows the modeling our economist uses to project our revenue impact and recovery, specifically around sales and use tax. We have revised our original scenario of a V-shaped recovery into more of a model of a U-shaped recovery, a more prolonged recovery over a longer period of time. But we are closely watching a new letter, and that is a K-shaped recovery, where elements of our economy rebound while others remain stagnant or continue to fall behind. The mayor talked about supporting a sustainable and equitable recovery, and it is critical to combat the effects of a K-shaped recovery because it is that K-shape, that element of stagnation or a lack of recovery that we're going to need to make sure that we focus our investments in. What might happen in a K-shaped recovery? You can look at the impact of the pandemic and see that we felt that our retail, restaurant, and tourism industries were impacted substantially. And you could think of what the employment impacts in those areas are, and the prolonged recovery in those industries will have an impact on those populations in the city that are most vulnerable. Denver's economy is heavily driven by tourism and other retail services and saw large losses in both consumer spending and employment. Consumer spending in Denver year-to-date through July, retail and food services in particular, at the top of this chart, is currently down 15.7%, more than 7 times the national average of 2.1%. And this drives a particular challenge with the composition of our operating budget's revenue because it is so heavily dependent on sales and use tax and other tourism and hospitality revenues. The general fund is projected to be 14.6% lower, or $220 million less than the original projected 2020 budget. And that represents 10.1% lower than the 2019 final budget revenue collections. We will see some recovery in 2021, approximately 9%. I know this chart shows a number that's incrementally lower. That's because of some accounting changes that we did. But economically, our revenues are growing by about 9%. But as the mayor noted, it is very uncertain and still leaves us with a $190 million budget gap. This is driven largely by losses in sales and use tax revenues, which make up nearly 50% of our city's general fund revenue. And currently, that revenue stream is projected to be down in 2020 by 11.6%. We expect to see a recovery of 15% in 2021, but that is growing off of a lower compromised base in 2020. Also contributing greatly to the budget deficit is a 66% drop in lodgers tax revenues. And that is at the heart of this tourism and hospitality impact that we're seeing across the city. 66% drop pales in comparison to the numbers that we saw during the Great Recession. It is the most significant drop witnessed in modern times and compared to the Great Recession of an 18% drop. Fortunately, we have financial management tools and an incredible financial management staff that have been available to respond to this challenge. For 2021, agencies are implementing a total of $154 million worth of savings. And those include, and this is not the entire list, but the highlights, of $39 million of reduced hiring and holding more than 400 career service positions vacant. $14.5 million by suspending a general fund transfer to our capital improvement program. $12 million generated by citywide furloughs, $9.6 million through fleet replacement reductions, $7 million through vacancies in sworn staff and police and fire due to smaller recruit classes, $7 million in technology equipment projects and licensing savings, $4.5 million from vacancies in the Sheriff's Department, $3.2 million due to forecasted lower jail population continuing into 2021, $3.9 million of utility and facility savings, and $2.3 million reduced uniform overtime spending in safety agencies. It's been an incredible amount of effort to generate those proposals, and as the mayor said, there will be some incremental service impacts over the course of 2021. But at the same time, while we were making those difficult choices, we also chose to invest in key areas of the city. Those include $5 million for the operation of a new leased facility in 48th Avenue shelter, $1.5 million in homeless outreach resources, $3 million by way of the Human Services Department budget for property tax relief, TANF cash support, and eviction assistance programs, each at $1 million. $1 million for the STAR program, which will hopefully leverage an additional $1 million with Caring for Denver funds to get to a total program of $2 million. $827 million to support new parkland and COVID cleaning and rec centers. $500,000 in youth violence prevention programming. $300,000 to increase immigration legal defense fund. $3.5 million for the Colorado Convention Center operations to support a possible partial year closure of that facility, assuming that the state does not continue to leverage it for public health response. And then 2.3 in technology mandatory increases in maintenance agreements, and $9.3 million in insurance premiums, as well as a contribution to the Denver Employee Retirement Fund to make sure that we are properly supporting the sustainability of that fund. We also have some revenue increases contained in this. There are few, but I wanted to highlight a few of those that we are implementing. Court research fees of $3 million in our court program. To be clear, this is for people who would like to research court documents. We found that our fee was less than what the state is charging. We brought that up to parity with the state. Property tax mills of $9 million in the general fund, and I'm going to come back and talk about that one in a second in a little bit more detail. And online convenience fees estimated at $3 million. For the property tax mills, we passed a ballot measure in 2012 that provided for the city to leverage what had been reduced or credited mills in property tax in years where we don't have a reassessment, which is going to be in next year, for next year. That afforded Denver the opportunity to increase property tax mills in the general fund, this is just the general fund portion, of 0.448 mills, and therefore providing $9 million, which avoided $9 million more in additional cuts in the general fund. We are also going to be deploying this practice in human services, in housing, as well as in our social services program, and I forgot the last one, sorry. So those three programmatic areas. Oh, and capital program. I apologize, Laura. My team will talk to me about that after this presentation. So we are doing that in each of those three areas to make sure that we are supporting people in need in this community as well as sustainable recovery. So let me talk a little bit more about our plan for revenue adjustments in our capital program. In 2021, we will accelerate our Elevate Denver bond program where resources are already secured, and by launching another $170 million for projects in neighborhoods across the city. When coupled with our annual capital improvement program, the city will invest $478 million in capital programming through 2023. Including job training opportunities to help people build careers in the skills and trades, and to provide opportunities for small business and micro businesses and women and minority-owned businesses. Our return on capital investments by way of deployed CIP funds is double. For every $1 million that we invest in our capital program, it generates $2 million in economic output at a time period, during this 3-year period, when it is needed the most. This is when people need that support, even if it does not avoid job cuts, it helps support current employment during this time period. So it's very important. And this is a page that we took out of the Great Recession. During that time period, we activated our bond program, our Better Denver bond program, and deployed those resources. It was an incredible lesson learned on financial sustainability and economic resilience to deploy those dollars, get those dollars out into the community, and soften the economic impact. This budget contains contingency and reserve funds to prepare the city for uncertain economic and public health situations ahead. Specifically, it sets aside 2% for our contingency funds as required by charter, and it also maintains 12% fund balance in 2020 as well as in 2021. This is very important in terms of the uncertainty that we might be seeing in the third and fourth quarter of 2020 and the first and second quarter of 2021. You want to make sure you have reserves, a safety net for your budget, just like we did to start this budget year. With that, I want to thank again my finance team, all the city agencies, and all the work that has been put in over the past months, and will continue. Our efforts will continue to make sure that we have a financially healthy and sustainable city. And with that, I will turn it back over to the mayor for questions.
Thank you, Brendan. And as we get ready to go to questions, I'll just put one pin in the discussion around fund balance. It seems a revisionist history. We're repeating ourselves every year. We talk about the importance of a healthy fund balance. Thank God we do, because had we not had a fund balance to fall back on in 2020, we would have been in a lot of trouble. And looking toward 2021, the same scenario repeats itself as it did for this year. And so one reason why we push back on efforts to poach or to decrease the fund balance is for moments like this in 2020, and as we're looking toward 2021, that we have the cushion to fall back on and the ability to continue to keep critical services moving forward. Let's go to Q&A.
You can unmute your phones. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, this is Janet with 9 News. I have a couple.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Janet.
Sorry, I just have them all written down. I usually go to so the first one, I'm just wondering what makes Denver different, because we were down 15.7%, which is more than 7 times the national or the U.S. average. So I'm wondering what makes us different.
Did you hear the question?
Yes,
Go
yes.
ahead.
So I think what makes Denver different is you have to first acknowledge that the national numbers are national numbers. That is both urban areas and rural areas all combined. So you're going to get some different comparisons. That was not a comparison of all urban areas in the country. That was a comparison of national statistics. But I will say, with a very robust tourism and hospitality industry in Denver, we were very vulnerable when it came to a pandemic that restricted access to our businesses, restricted the ability for people to travel to our city. So, but I will say that I don't know that I would represent it as being any more exposed as any other major city. It's just where we compare to the nation.
Well said, yeah.
Your follow-up? Janet, did you have another question?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Another question I had is, I know we talked about reducing the overtime spending for safety agencies, and so wondering if DPD is included on that, and how do we achieve that with all of the protests and demonstrations that might be happening into the evening hours?
So both police and fire were represented on that. Both organizations committed to an active management of their overtime budget as part of the budget planning process. You note an environment where things are unpredictable. And we will have to respond to that unpredictability, and that's what I had mentioned, 2% contingency. That is budget that is set aside to respond to unforeseen conditions. And if needed, if we see some uncertain circumstances arise, we'll go through a public process to transact contingency to respond to that.
Gabby, this is David Sachs of Denver. Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Thanks. I'm not sure if this is for the mayor or for Brendan, but you'd mentioned more than 400 vacant positions, and I'd love to know how that will sort of trickle down and affect everyday Denverites in their day-to-day days.
You want to go ahead and start?
Sure, I'll start.
Yeah.
Again, this highlights the work that the agencies did. First is that they are vacant positions, so we're not talking about impacting employees with those proposals. But you're right to note that 400 fewer people providing services is going to impact our services across the city. I think agencies try to be thoughtful. One of the things that I should have mentioned earlier in my talking points was that we went through a very intentional equity filter process when we were asking agencies for impacts in their budgets, making sure that they made accommodations to whether it be library hours, rec center hours, hours of service, customer wait times, those kind of challenges. But you're right that we won't be able to avoid the totality of the impacts by having 400 fewer civilian employees. So we're going to have to kind of roll with the punches. Again, it's much like the overtime question about how do we respond to uncertainty when it comes to our operations. If there are particular pain points in our services, we have the opportunity to go back and modify our budget during the course of the annual budget year to accommodate for that. Mayor?
And the only thing I will add to that is that we'll just remind folks that in 2020 we did a voluntary retirement program. And how many employees opted into that?
I believe, Stephanie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was nearly 200 employees citywide.
And with very few exceptions, those positions will remain vacant.
So I just want to clarify there are no specific pain points that residents might experience from over 400 vacant positions.
So I'll just highlight a few areas, but I'm gonna make sure that I'm not just representing the agencies. For those people who are watching, we are going to begin council hearings over the next pretty much 10 days, where we're going to get into the particulars about each individual agency and their budget impacts and their operational impacts and service impacts. So please watch there if you want more details. But what we did, good example was there were some positions that were reduced in our library system, but the one we tried to be opportunistic with the impacts that we saw. And the opportunity was that because of construction, the Central Library will be closed down for a portion of the year as part of renovations funded by bond program. And because of that, we were able to kind of isolate that impact in one location while preserving library hours across the city. There are other areas in our permitting counter and in our rec center. There are positions in the Department of Finance where we're going to be dealing with incrementally fewer staff, and it's just going to put an increased burden on other employees who are still here with the city.
Areas that citizens may see more apparent, fewer mowings in the parks, for example. Parks and Rec is going to do everything they can to keep up, but those are some of the more readily sight unseen kind of, the grass may get just a little longer than typical in our parks, as an example. Obviously, they're going to try to stay on top of it.
Thank you.
Next question.
Yeah, hey, Gabby, this is Conrad with The Post. Can I sneak in quick?
Go ahead.
All right. Hey, I'm not sure if this is for Brandon or the mayor. Brandon, earlier today you said that this budget is contingent essentially on the virus not resurging. And there are some estimates that say it certainly could uptick again. Could you give us a little insight on what would happen, what type of look you'd have to take at the budget again, where those where you might focus and what might have to be cut?
Sure. And if the team who's controlling the slides could maybe go back to the beginning. There was one slide that I presented that had the lines on it. One more. This one. So in this slide, this represents a multitude of different scenarios and kind of how our forecasting, economic forecasting, has changed over time. One of those is this dark red or orange line that says Scenario 3, virus resurgence. Now, I will say that this is a hypothetical model. We would have to first determine exactly the severity of the outbreak, what kind of public health actions have to be taken in response to it. So this is really just a hypothetical way of forecasting. But what you could see is our current forecast is the green scenario versus the red scenario. So what you see is an increment of gradual underperformance, extended stress on our sales and use tax. So think of having to go back into a shelter-in-place type environment. So what we saw in March and April was far more significant than what we're seeing here in terms of impact to our sales and use tax numbers in particular. I don't want to presuppose the type of actions that we would have to take, but we have taken a really thoughtful approach to this, and I've asked agencies to continue to be mindful about filling positions, about posting for recruitments, and keeping options open because we are uncertain. But I will come back to the value of reserves and rainy day accounts. That is why they are there. That is why we're trying to preserve 12%, because if something like this were to happen in the latter portion of the year, you want that reserve available to make sure you have a safety net for your finances.
Well, let me just say this, just like at home, if you have a savings account, you have a moment where you're challenged and you have to use the savings account. The last thing you can afford is another challenge to require you to go back into that savings account. And so having deployed 3% or over $90 million of our reserve fund, the last thing we need is to have to go back and to deal with another challenging year. And so here we go again. Since you mentioned COVID, it boils down to our responsibility of wearing masks, socially distancing, washing your hands, and being smart. And particularly as the second virus is introduced into the society or into the community now, the flu virus, hunkering down and being smart is even more important. And so this orange line scenario is what we're trying to avoid, and we control that. And so this is a difficult time. I would hate, it would be very difficult. It would be disastrous for us to have to go through this scenario once again and to dip even further into reserves or to further cut services. Folks, I want to just compare this, and I don't mean to go on about this, but I cannot underscore the severity of the challenge that we face in 2020 as we look toward 2021, at least early on, in that what we experienced this year, it outstrips almost twice, if not 3 times, what we saw in the entire Great Recession. And when I came in 2011, we were already into the bone marrow. We couldn't go any further. Well, folks, we're in the bone marrow in a matter of 6 months. And there's not very much more for us to go deeper without severely impacting our ability to deliver the services that we all count on as taxpayers, without disrupting our workforce, and without really hurting our ability to maintain a good, healthy credit rating and keeping everyone safe and healthy, which are our top priorities as a city. So I don't mean to keep preaching that, but I cannot underscore. I don't want us to walk away from that lightly. That's a very important point.
Next question.
Yeah, this is Ivan with Denver 7. Mayor Hancock, couple questions for you. Is a reduction in OT for police and scaling back hiring new officers, is it just a way to trim and balance the budget, or was there also some pressure that you saw from protests throughout this year?
I think it's important to look at our approach to the police department as a system and not episodic. The reality is that it takes months, if not a year or more, to put an officer on the street. And so when we say we are cutting back training academies and we're going to train less individuals to join our police department, folks, we are setting back our ability to staff our police department, our ability to keep everyone safe in the city by years. So this is a budgetary decision that we are making in consideration of a system of developing law enforcement in our city, not in response to protests. We are also experiencing a severe rise in crime, which is greatly concerning for all of us. And we are in the midst of the pandemic, in the midst of social unrest and rising crime. We are taxing our current police officers a great deal. And so, yeah, there's a great deal of concern here because we are responding budgetarily with regards to our police, our fire, and our sheriffs. And it is a big concern because we understand the amount of time it takes to train and to put on the street for effective policing to occur. Chief Payson, would you like to add anything additional to that? Okay. Director Murphy, Robinson? Okay, great.
Next question.
You had another question?
Lastly, Mayor, what's your takeaway from City Council's rejection of a 2-year contract with the police union, and what are those next steps now that are going to be taken?
Well, it's a process. Watching the council decision last night was very difficult and unfortunate, but we're not done. This is a process. We have a lot of work to do. The question before City Council is, what's their plan? I think it's important that they have to answer that question now that they have stepped up and did what they did with regards to the CBA for our police department. But in our minds, we're going to continue to do what we've been doing for the last decade, and that is continue to innovate, continue to reform, and continue to hold accountable what I believe to be a police department that has been open and willing to listen to community, collaborate with the community, make pivots and changes in how they strategically keep the people of the city safe. And we're going to continue to do that. I would tell you, you'll be hard-pressed to find a city that has made as many reforms since 2010 as the city of Denver has. And a lot of what's being pushed for across the country, we are doing with some pretty innovative, award-winning programs. And we're going to continue to do that, but also being open to continue to communicate and work with the community to find those opportunities. But let me say this, that was a very difficult decision to watch. The police department, the police officers gave up $5 million in concessions. You know, they understood that they had to have some carrot for their officers to pass this, and certainly they understood and said to us directly, and even wrote a letter to City Council, if the city is not in position in July of 2022 to give these raises, we will be back to the table with you to figure out those steps. And so it's unfortunate that the decision was made as it was last night.
Next question.
This is Vinny
Yeah,
Valjudice at Bloomberg News in Denver. May I ask a question?
Go ahead, Benny.
Yes. Hi, Mayor. Regarding the police budget, will Denver, like other U.S. cities, be shifting money from the police to mental health and these types of programs that will in turn respond to with the police to enhance 911 calls for mental health issues, this type of thing? Thank you very much.
Yeah, Benny, that's what I was referring to, and thank you for your question because, again, as a city, you know, several years ago we started looking at how we look at policing or really dealing with effectively with crime on a broader scale. It's not just policing, it's a community issue, and that included really addressing the issues of mental health, and that's where the co-responder program came from. We are in the midst of a pilot program around our STARS program, which sends non-police response to crises in a community. And we are making those investments in this budget. Next year for 2021 includes additional continuing investment in co-responder as well as additional investment in the STARS program. And so Denver had already been moving in that direction. 90% of our budget in the police department is personnel. And we are working to continue to address the issues challenging crime and crime statistics in our city beyond just policing. And it's not something we're doing in response to this episode. It's in response to a system that we saw that drives crime no matter where you are in this country, no matter what the circumstances, and how we can best combat that by addressing the human condition and meeting our residents where they are and taking a more broader approach than just policing. And so we're going to continue that. We are increasing our investments there while also, again, holding our responsibility of keeping our residents safe and healthy in the city.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there anyone who hasn't gone yet?
I've gone, but I do have another question. This is Janet with 9 News.
Go ahead, Janet.
Really two questions. So the first one is the budget calls for $70 million for affordable housing and services for those experiencing homelessness. So the question is, what happens if Denver voters approve the sales tax this November? Would that $70 million just be extra money for homelessness, or could that money be allocated, say, to another department if that sales tax is approved?
We're going to ask Britta Fisher, as our Director of Housing and Opportunity in the City of Denver.
Thanks for that question, Janet. The question I understood was, with a budget of $70 million, if the taxpayers and the residents of Denver pass 2B, what would that do to the budget? The budget remains. That is what we are committed to provide for people experiencing homelessness, to provide affordable housing and critical services to keep people healthy, housed, and connected in Denver. If the 2B does pass, that will be additive to this budget and help us to serve more people and make a bigger difference.
Very good, thank you. And then the last question I just had was about the reserve fund at 12%. Obviously, given the situation of unprecedented times, is there been any talk about reducing that, or is that a mandate to keep it at that 12%?
So thanks for the question. We did reduce it because we started 2020 with a 17% reserve, and we are spending that down to 12%. What we're trying to do now is preserve that reserve through these uncertain times to make sure that that safety net is sustained. So that's why we have used it for 2020. It's supposed to be there as a cushion or a safety net for our finances. It operated as it should. Now our job is to make the thoughtful, tough decisions that are contained in this budget to preserve it, so that way if we do have a resurgence, it's available for us to rely upon.
And you notice how diplomatically he corrected me. I think I said 3%. It's 5% that we drew down on the reserve. So that's very good.
That's correct.
Thank you for doing
Last question for someone who hasn't asked a question yet.
Thanks. This is Ed Seelover with the Denver Business Journal. Mayor, you talked a couple of times about revitalizing the economy, supporting local business jobs. Could you identify a couple of things in this budget that you think will really help bring them back? And I know you gave a pretty broad overview, but what specifically are you investing in that you think will help to bring back and preserve jobs?
Yeah, Ed, great question. So first of all, take a look at our acceleration of capital projects. There are a few sectors in the economy that go through the entire ecosystem of the economy as construction and design. We used the same tool in 2008. I was president of the city council at the time, worked closely with the Hickenlooper administration, and we intentionally crafted a strategy to accelerate our Go Denver bond at that time and to infuse the economy with these dollars so that we can keep people working, not only in construction industry, but you've got accountants, you've got suppliers, you've got all type of industries that are touched by construction. And so that is a very intentional tool. Very early on during the COVID and our response to COVID, we had a call with City Council. And I remember telling City Council, one of the tools we're going to deploy very intentionally is the acceleration of our Elevate Denver bond program. And it's not just the bond program, but we have other programs such as the reconstruction of 16th Street Mall, the Convention Center, even what's happening at the airport. These are programs that we're already committed to and already statutorily had dollars allocated for. We could have stopped and said, well, wait, but we actually are intentionally accelerating these dollars so that we can keep this economy moving. And Ed, I'll finish with this. You might recall during the Great Recession, there was a time the only sector that was building or doing anything construction design-wise in the city of Denver was the city of Denver. Private sector completely shut down. And but for the city of Denver doing that with the Go Denver bond program, there would have been a lot more devastation with people in regards to unemployment.
One thing to add to that is that our Denver Economic Development Office also has access into those capital project funds and integrates workforce training programs. So it's about sustaining one industry by way of construction, but it's also about gaining access for folks who don't currently work in that industry to that industry as they implement those programs.
And I think the last thing I'll share is that we are continuing conversations with our airlines to continue to expand at the airport. Mm-hmm. Obviously, as Denver right now is the leading airport for passenger traffic in the country. And I think that says a lot for their commitment in Denver and our commitment to continue to try to expand to different markets. This will come back, and we want to be at the forefront of that expansion and hit the ground running. And we're going to be able to do that because of the efforts we're undertaking right now.
David, do you have one more question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could let us know if there are any major projects, like big capital projects that are going to be delayed or nixed because of these budget shortfalls, and if not, why not?
I could take this. So at this point in time, we are trying to accelerate our capital program over the next 3 years. So this is an opportunity not to pull back on those projects, but to lean in and push them forward so that way we my talking points before said, for every $1 million we roll out in our capital program, we get $2 million worth of economic return. And that is a really big deal when you're talking about over $400 million worth of acceleration over a 3-year period of time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.